Yes, my main takeaway message for the conference was the fact that the DAAD looked like it had anticipated the pandemic, because in March of 2019, we were in Johannesburg, Port Elizabeth particularly, to talk about digitization under the DAAD's DigiFace project. And our focus was on transitioning the centers of excellence to become digital. And that included reorienting the staff, the students, and also the infrastructure to be able to live up to the digital transformation across higher education in the world. So my takeaway was that even though we had not, as developing countries, and especially in the context of Ghana, anticipated the pandemic, we at the center were able to cope because we had already started transitioning in anticipation of digitization, but not in response to the pandemic. For example, I did stress the fact that many of us started taking lessons in Moodle, attending online lectures in how to digitize our content and how to engage with students, examine students. That is to teach the students from a distance and still not lose quality. So in that respect, the transition wasn't too difficult for us, but it was still some challenge, because while some of us had been trained, there was still some degree of resistance. And the resistance in the sense that some students and some staff felt it was not the same, that there is definitely a difference between an online program and a program in person, or let's say live lectures. So even though some students attended lectures, they thought it was just something to occupy them because their minds were not ready for such a transition. And I also did indicate that the infrastructure was a challenge, particularly internet connectivity. It was already a challenge in many African universities, in many Southern universities, and more so when the pandemic hit and everybody had to go online. The already weak infrastructural base as far as internet connectivity was concerned was further stressed, and we could hardly stay online. But however, we still managed to get something going in the midst of the pandemic. So the takeaway is that it helped us not to lose everything because of the pandemic, but definitely it did have an impact on how we handled higher education. In many universities in Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Ghana, numbers are a challenge. That lecturers and students have to compete for small spaces, be it in the lecture room, be it in the libraries, be it with research facilities, and so on. Maybe to put it into context, there are times I taught 500-600 students. I mean, can you imagine that in one class? And I had to grade that manually. And sometimes students stood whilst lectures were going on. So what digitization offered was for some people to be away, especially when we had hybrid lectures, for some to be away from the lecture room and some to stay in. So if you can't find space, you could be outside and still not lose everything. So that is one of the strong points of digitization, that it will help us manage the weak infrastructural base of our universities. And that is one thing that it helped us do during the pandemic, that we could have some remote lectures, and it allowed us to manage the deficiencies in our infrastructure. Some could do the library from a distance, some could do the lectures from a distance. Digitizing also meant that grading was somehow easier for us because we were able to do it electronically. As I said, the challenges were that For southern universities, we were already behind. We lacked the basic infrastructure to deliver conventional higher education. Many of our books were not digital. The course material were not digital. The curriculum, not digital. So within the space of 2 weeks, you had to transition from 100% in-person programs to 100% virtual program, and it meant that the leap was big, and it doesn't matter how you approached it, you were going to have problems. So first, the gulf in infrastructure meant that some others were able to transition, but we, those probably who didn't have the infrastructure up to speed, had to lose some quality. Secondly, as I rightly mentioned, because of my consistent travels around and also coming here often, I encounter some form of digital learning. So I know it's part of higher education pedagogy, but there are some people who haven't done that before. So the reorientation to accept that this is now a normal way of delivering lessons and grading students, the resistance was there, both from the student and also from the instructor perspective. So we had those challenges. Secondly, as I said, to transition fully to a digital system, you need to prepare both the instructor and the student and the infrastructure. We didn't have time to do all these things. So we had problems. There were times you are delivering lectures and then somebody is not hearing you, somebody can't connect, the speed is slow, so voice is dragging. So a lot of content was lost. The other problem was that, unlike in many places, in much of our context, internet connectivity is limited to mostly urban areas. So you have students who are compelled to go back to their homes in rural Ghana, where the internet connectivity is not there, is weak, or is in certain locations alone. So those people, some of them lost out. I remember in one situation, the only spot in a place where one of my students was located was near a farmhouse. So while he had to go there, he was compelled to be there to do the lecture. You could hear goats and sheep bleating at the background. He had no alternative. He had to share the space with the farmhouse. So that is how we went through these things, that we managed to get off something, but it wasn't easy. And in places where, or in times when we wanted to have that visual contact, internet connectivity meant that the students had to switch off their cameras so that they could hear me. That meant that I can't know whether the student is still there or he just put on the connection and then he's doing something else. So it made monitoring difficult. It made regulations of the programming difficult for us. But yes, we were still able to pull through. I must say that at the center, we were fortunate because of the digitization program. We had some of this infrastructure already being put in place, even though we had not gotten up to speed in terms of how to use them. It was easier for us to cope. But for the rest of the university and the rest of the country, these challenges were there. And you can imagine we didn't have digital libraries. Mostly our books are not digital, they are physical. So if the student is at home and you even deliver the lectures online, how is he going to get the material? So I say it was internetization of our lectures rather than digitization, because we just went online to teach, but we didn't take the whole instruction there. So that I would say those were some of the challenges we faced. Yesterday, I did say that just like Africa was able to leap from not having telephones, not having landlines, to mobile phones. And if you look at mobile phone penetration, even in sub-Saharan Africa, It competes with Europe or sometimes in America or sometimes even outcompete them. That is, we went from no phones to this higher levels. So the prospect of us moving from no infrastructure to full digital infrastructure exists, but the investment requirements are huge. The economic implications are huge. And following COVID, where you had many of our economies taking a hit, and many of the countries in our context having to turn to the IMF and others for economic stabilization, there is no way we can achieve this digital transformation because of the investments required. And our universities are mostly public, so we look up to government to provide this infrastructure. So in the midst of these economic challenges, we are not going to be able to make that transformation because we need to make a huge leap. And let me just put it into context here, that if we were talking about ZEF 2019 and our place in 2019, what you had to do to digitize, we had to do 5, 6, or even 10 times that. So that is the reality we are dealing with. So I did stress yesterday that post-COVID, we are not going or fitting in the new normal. We are going back to the old normal because we didn't actually fully transition. Online teaching, online instruction was a coping strategy, was something we put in place to avoid the total collapse of our education system. It was not something that delivered up to the quality that we expected because we weren't fully prepared for it. And after COVID, we don't have the resources to migrate and to sustain what we're doing. So we are gradually transitioning back. Let me give you an example in Ghana. University professors had to demand additional pay for teaching online. That is because it introduced new dynamics to our regular schedules that we knew as professors. So there is something in Ghana called OTA, online teaching allowance. And it had to take a lot of tussle with government until it was approved. So that is just one example of the implications and the cost requirements of going digital. Apart from the infrastructure, the human cost too is there, and governments are struggling to keep pace with it. So yes, the desire is there, the plans are there, but the means to implement them is somehow a challenge for us. Yes, yeah, it was my second time in Latin America. I was in Colombia, I think, in 2018, and I stayed mostly in Bogota and Medellin. But this time, I went to Valledupar, the campus in the campus of peace, La Paz, they call it, and I really experienced, apart from the warmth of the people, the openness of our hosts there, I saw stark realities and similarities between Ghana and Latin America than I have found anywhere in the world. In Valledupar, the environment was basically the same in some places, dry, hot. The crops that grew there, the agriculture system was mostly identical. I found cocoa, I found the peppers, I found the vegetables, the coffees, and the rest. That looks more like Ghana to me. I found millet, I even found cassava, and all those things that we have in Ghana, those things that form the mainstay of our economy were there. I also found out that we had similar problems. We had a large group of smallholder farm base competing with established multinational corporations, and the challenge of supporting these groups to gain some market power and gain some more income, just like we have in Ghana. And they, in Colombia, I must say, have been able to make some progress in terms of improving smallholder productivity, smallholder processing. The challenge with us in Ghana is value addition. So whilst we export largely raw materials and earn very little for it, they add value. So, for example, I carried a lot of Colombian coffee produced by farmers, highly processed honey that was processed in such a way that you just love it. We don't have those systems working well in Ghana, and the lessons to apply from Colombia in Ghana is just real. And maybe Germany may not want to hear this, but I think that we may learn more collaborating with Colombia than we would from Germany.